Chapter 1. A Manor, a Maid, and an Invitation. Marley Combe, nestled among gentle hills and thick hedgerows, seemed immune to anything as grim as murder. Its whitewashed cottages and rose-draped trellises could have been lifted from a country inn's framed painting. Life followed a steady rhythm. Milk at dawn, gossip at the post office by 10, tea by 4, and church bells on Sunday mornings. Even the sparrows chirped with decorum. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her parlor at Rose Cottage, knew that quiet places often concealed the loudest secrets. Her teacup rested on a doily. Her knitting needles tapped softly, stitching a neat row. Lace curtains, parted just enough, let her observe the village without seeming to prise. She never spied, only observed, which was entirely different. Just past 10, young Peter from the post office arrived, all gangly limbs and awkwardness. "Morning, Miss Marple. Got a hand-delivered one for you." She smiled gently. "Thank you, Peter. Give my regards to your mother." The envelope was creamy and stiff, the handwriting elegant yet firm. "Mrs. Letitia Blackwell cordially invites you to tea at Greystone Manor this Friday at 4 o'clock. A gathering of neighbors, light refreshments, and an afternoon of civilized conversation." Miss Marple read it twice. Stone Manor had stood empty for nearly a decade since old Admiral Redfern's death, its reputation one of gloom rather than ghosts, a house that hoarded shadows even in sunlight. That Mrs. Blackwell had moved in 2 months ago was already Marley Combe's chief topic. No one knew where she'd come from, or why she'd chosen a village so far from anything loud or fashionable. Miss Marple sipped her tea, thoughtful. She would go, of course, not for pleasure, exactly, but for curiosity, which always drew her to such invitations and manners. Friday arrived like any other in Alacombe, quiet and warm, with the scent of honeysuckle drifting through the lanes at exactly 3:45. Miss Marple adjusted her straw hat in the mirror, slipped on her gloves, and set out Greystone Manor stood like a silent sentinel at the edge of the village. Stony-faced and imposing ivy clung to its walls. Trying to hold the building down, its windows were tall and dark with curtains that never seemed to be fully open. The door was opened by a timid maiden, a plain blue dress. She looked barely 20 and had the nervous eyes of a deer just before it bolts. "Miss Marple, Mom, please come in the drawing room," was too large. Miss Marple thought for such a small number of guests. She counted 7 others, the vicar and his wife, Mrs. Barton from the bookshop, Drimp, a widower named Mr. Ellis, and Colonel Fairchild, with his booming laugh hand, large mustache. Mrs. Blackwell entered a moment later. She was in her 50s perhaps, handsome rather than beautiful, with dark eyes that missed nothing and a voice that never quite softened even when smiling. "Miss Marple, how lovely to say you'll do have some tea. I do hope you'll enjoy the lemon scone I had cooked." Agatha, especially the conversation that followed, was the kind common to English tetables, whether the state of the train station, a possible flower show, and the peculiar new habits of Mrs. Pembroke's cat. But Miss Marple was not listening for the words she watched. She noticed how Mrs. Blackwell glanced at the curtains more than once, as though fearing what might lie behind them. She noticed how the maid jumped at the sound of a dropped spoon. She noticed, and this was the strangest, how no one seemed to know quite what Mr. Ellis did before moving to the village last month. Was charming, yes, and well-read, but vague in a way that set her mental clock ticking. And then it happened to scream, high, sharp, and full of terror. It cut through the drawing room like a blade through butter. Everyone froze. It came from stairs, cried the vicar's wife. "Probably that silly maid again," muttered Colonel Fairchild, but Miss Marple was already on her feet. The guests followed the sound. To the upper floor, the hallway was narrow, lined with closed doors, one of them slightly ajar, revealed the bedroom. The maid stood inside, white-faced and trembling, one hand pressed to her chest, her other hand pointed, shaking there on the carpeted floor. Lay a man, mid-50s, well-dressed, hair graying at the temples. His arms were spread unnaturally, and a dark stain was beginning to spread beneath. His head, Dr. Kemp pushed through knelt Bezidat's body and shook his head. He's gone, been dead, at least an hour, I'd say. Miss Blackwell appeared in the doorway behind him. Her face had lost all its color. I didn't understand. Who is that? I've never seen him before in my life. Miss Marple didn't say anything at first. She stepped into the room, moving with quiet precision. Her eyes scanned the bed, the windowsill, the small writing desk in the corner, and then she looked at the curtains. Heavy velvet closed, except just at the edge, a slight gap, as though someone had peeked out on. No one noticed, as Miss Marple reached out and gently touched the curtain. Him, she said softly. The police should be called, and no one is to leave thy house. The murder at Greystone Manor would send waves through Marley. Combe old secrets would rise. Friendships would splinter and fear would settle in like the mist on the moors, and at the heart of it, old Miss Marple, quiet, observant, knitting in her lap, would begin to unravel the truth, one thread at a time. Chapter 2, Whispers Behind Velvet Curtains. By the next morning, Marley Combe was humming with the kind of gossip latently death and mystery could inspire. The news traveled quickly, faster than the milkman's bicycle and louder than the church bell. A dead man in Greystone Manor, and no one knew who he was. That alone was enough to turn every head in the village and fill every teacup with speculation. But in Rose Cottage, Miss Marple was not speculating. She was remembering sitting at her breakfastable toast, untouched. She thought carefully about what she had seen in thought. Bedroom. The man had no identification, no wallet, no watch, not even a handkerchief. His clothes were neat, but plain, the kind one wore tarpaulin, and not to stand out, a traveling man, a salesman, or someone trying not to remembered. More importantly, how had he entered the house? Unnotified Stone Manor was not the sort of place where guests arrived unannounced, simply not in the middle of the day, and Mrs. Blackwell had claimed she didn't know. It's more him, but her reaction, her stunned silence, had struck Miss Marple as more complicated than simple shock. Jane, she told herself softly, you've seen that expression before. It was the face of a woman who recognized something but dared not say aloud. At the same hour, Inspector Hugh Craddock stood inside the drawing room, Hugh Greystone Manor notebook in hand. He was a solid man in his 40s, with dark high-rendered face, beginning to show the strain of rural murder cases. Too many secrets wrapped in too many smiles. Mrs. Blackwell sat opposite him, a shawl around her shoulders, though the fire had been lit. I've told you already, Inspector said, in a voice that hovered between exhaustion and annoyance. I have no idea what the man is. I didn't invite him. I didn't even know he was in the house, and yet he was found in an upstairs bedroom. Caddick replied, Use Hythe. Doors were locked, the front and back. Both the maids swears she didn't let anyone in. He made a note, then glanced up. Any keys missing? Mrs. Blackwell hesitated. Not. Okay. No way, but I'll kick. Do please. She stood suddenly. I can't help you if you don't believe. Might's not a matter of belief, madame. It's a matter of fact. She left the room cross-eyed and looked at the young constable beside him. Get a list of everyone who was here yesterday. All the guests. The constable nodded. And find Miss Marple. Miss Marple, as it happened, was already in her way to the manor. She had decided after careful thought. A small inquiry was in order. Nothing intrusive, of course, just a friendly check-in after all. It wasn't every day that one witnessed a murder scene, and it was only proper to show concern. The maid, still pale, but less shaken, opened the door. Oh, Miss Marple. Kay, she whispered, it's all such a fright. I haven't slept a wink. "You poor thing," Miss Marple said. "Kindly, do sit with me for a moment. I've brought some shortbread." Very comic. They sat in the kitchen, a simple room with a red tiled floor, and a kipped clock ticking gently above the stove. "What's your name, dear?" "Lai," the girl said, blinking. "You were the one who found the body." She nodded. "I went up to tidy the guest rooms. Mrs. Blackwell doesn't usually like anyone in the east bedroom, but the door was ajar. I thought perhaps one of the guests had gone and been mistake." Her voice trailed off. Miss Marple took her hand gently. "And then you saw him?" "Yes, just lying there, so stilly." "Screamed?" "Of course you did. And before that, you didn't see or hear anything strange in the house?" Elsie shook her head. "No, ma'am. Only a sound, a creak in the stair. But when I looked, there was no one." Miss Marple's fingers paused over her knitting. "Bag and the curtains?" she asked gently. "The heavy ones?" "Oh yes. Dronty always are in that room, Mrs. Blackwell says the sunlight fades. There are." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I see. Thank you, Elsie." She left a moment. Lateran stepped quietly upstairs. The bedroom had been sealed, but not locked. The body was gone, taken by the coroner last night, but the shape of his presence still endured the faint scuff of his shoes on the floor, the pattern of rumpled carpet where he had fallen, and, of course, the curtains. Miss Marple approached them. Behind thick velvet curtains, there was not just a window, but a tiny latch, nearly invisible. She pressed it, and the panel of the wall slid back an inch with a click. "Ah," she said, very softly, "a servant's passage. How very old-fashioned, and how very useful for someone who didn't want to be seen." By mid-afternoon, Inspector Cock arrived at Rose Cottage, where Miss Marple was already steeping a second pot of Darjeeling. "Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat, "I need your eyes on this. You saw something yesterday. I can feel it." "I saw a great many things, Inspector," she replied pleasantly, "but I agree. This man was not a stranger to this house. Not truly. You think Mrs. Blackwell lied?" "Not necessarily," she said, pouring the tea and passing him a cup, "but I think she hid something. Such as the fact that the east bedroom contains a hidden passage, one that connects to the older servant corridors. It's quite possible the man came in that way." Cock blinked. "Good Lord. I also believe," she continued, "that Mrs. Blackwell recognized him, not fully, but enough to frighten her." "And who do you think he was?" "I don't know," Miss Marple said, "but I believe someone in Marley does. The question is, will they admit it before someone else dies?" Chapter 3. The Man with No Name, the Official Report. Printed on pale blue stationery and folded neatly on Inspector Cock's desk, said very little. Male, approximate age 55 to 60. Cause of death, blunt force trauma to the skull. Time of death, estimated between 1:30 and 3 p.m. No identification. No wallet, no documents, just a plain handkerchief in his pocket and a small scar near his left ear. Yet, despite his namelessness, the man was already the most talked about person in Marley Combe. By mid-morning, the village had turned into a whispering chorus. At the bakery, Mrs. Finch speculated he was a London criminal. Mr. Hale was certain he was an inspector sent to investigate the manor itself. Over at the post office, young Peter swore he'd seen the same man weeks ago, standing near the war memorial and looking up at Greystone Manor with strange intensity. I said, "Good morning," Peter told anyone who listened, and he just nodded, like he was too deep in thought to speak. Miss Marple, of course, heard all of it. She never dismissed gossip. It was often the shape of truth, if not its substance. She returned from the high street just before noon, a small paper bag of barley sugar in hand, and found a note waiting for her on the parlor table. It was from Inspector Cock. Miss Marple, a confidential request. Please come to the station as soon as convenient. We may have a clue. Cock. The Marley Combe Constabulary Station was modest. 2 desks, 1 filing cabinet, and a radio that never quite tuned correctly. Miss Marple arrived at 1 o'clock, her boots dry despite the light rain, her shawl neatly pinned. Cock met her at the door himself. He looked as though he hadn't slept. "Sway," he said, "I'd like you to see something." He led her into the small back office, where a photograph had been pinned to the wall. It was old, clearly taken years ago. The edges, curling slightly, showed a group of men and women, perhaps 8 in all, gathered around a garden-to-lawn summer party. Maybe. But it was the man in the back row that caught the eye. Miss Marple moved closer. The photo was faded, but the jawline, the deep-set eyes, the graying hair, it was him, the man from the east bedroom. Cock folded his arms. "We found this in a drawer of Mrs. Blackwell's desk, hidden beneath old tax records. She claims she doesn't remember the man." Miss Marple looked again. The photo had been taken outside a house, not Greystone Manor, but another large estate with a white fence and climbing wisteria. She tapped the image gently. "This is not England," she murmured. Cock blinked. "Sorry. The house style, the porch work, that tree jacaranda, I believe, not native here. I'd say somewhere warmer. South Africa perhaps, or Australia." Cock stared at the photograph again, as if it might rearrange itself. "You believe this man came from abroad?" "I believe this man was known abroad," she said, "which raises the question, what brought him to Marley Combe? And more importantly, what was his connection to Mrs. Blackwell?" That same afternoon, Greystone Manor felt different, quieter, heavier. Mrs. Blackwell had retreated to her private sitting room and was refusing visitors. The curtains in every room had been drawn. Even Martine's, her small gray poodle, had stopped barking, as if the house itself had taken a breath and held it. In the kitchen, Elsie, the maid, scrubbed at a pot that was already clean. She didn't look up when the knock came at the back door. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "May I come in, Elsie?" The girl nodded quickly, her eyes rimmed red. "I'm sorry, Miss Marple," she said. "Everything's wrong. I feel like something terrible is still here." Miss Marple set down her bag and sat beside her. "Elsie, I need to ask you something rather serious, and I hope you'll trust me." The girl looked up, hesitated, then nodded. "That photograph in the drawing room, the one near the fireplace, the group of people in front of the yacht, did you ever notice the man in the back?" Elsie blinked. "Oh, you mean the dark-haired one? He's not in it anymore. Mrs. Blackwell took that photo down last week and trimmed it. I thought it was odd. Trimmed it." "Yes, she said it didn't flatter her, but I saw the old photo before she cut it. That man was in the background, watching." Miss Marple's hands folded calmly in her lap, but her mind ticked forward. "Thank you, Elsie. That's very helpful." That evening, as the sun bled out across the fields behind Marley Combe, Miss Marple sat at her desk with the photograph Inspector Cock had given her. She had asked to borrow it just for a night, and he, despite a small protest, had agreed. She stared at the image again. She knew that face now, not just from the east bedroom, or from the gossip, but from years ago, a story she had once heard whispered at a charity garden party in St. Mary Mead. A man who had vanished, a fortune mislaid, a marriage broken under quiet scandal, and a woman, Letitia Blackwell and Lee. She hadn't been Letitia Blackwell then. Chapter 4. The widow. A Wazan train came to Marley Combe that night. Not a heavy, stormy rain, but the steady, whispering kind that makes windows blur and secrets feel closer to the surface. Miss Marple, now certain that the murdered man and Mrs. Blackwell shared a past, rose early the next morning before breakfast, before knitting, even before the first bell from St. Luke's Church. She had decided to pay a visit to someone who, though largely dismissed by the villagers as a fading flower, had a memory like a cabinet, well organized and full of things people assumed had been forgotten. Mrs. Wilfred Galbraith, a retired schoolmistress with a fondness for hard-boiled sweets and scandal, lived alone on Ash Tree Lane. She had taught half the village at one time or another and remembered every one of them parents, pets, and spelling test scores included. When Miss Marple knocked, the older woman opened the door in a mauve cardigan, her expression disapproving. "Jane Marple," she said flatly, "you only come when something's afoot. Is that not a good reason to visit?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "I've brought plum jam. Come in." They settled with tea and toast beside a gas heater, the rain tapping at the window like a metronome. "I need to ask about someone," Miss Marple said, "and I believe you may remember her under a different name. A woman, dark eyes, sharp voice, liked expensive hats, possibly lived abroad for some time. I believe she was once known as Letty Harwood." Mrs. Galbraith frowned. "Letty Harwood," she repeated slowly. "That's not a name I've heard in years. Good heavens, I taught her younger sister. Letty went off to South Africa in the 30s, didn't she? Married to some businessman. Bit of a scandal. I think something about her husband's partner disappearing." Miss Marple's ears perked, tearing. "Yes, a man with money. Troubles, if I remember right. The whole affair was hush-hush. Some said he ran off with investors' funds. Others whispered Letty knew more than she let on. Do you remember his name?" Mrs. Galbraith leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowing. With effort. "Gerald," she said at last. "Gerald Winshaw. That was it. Went missing under very odd circumstances." Miss Marple didn't speak for a moment, because that was the name she remembered now. From a half-told tale over bridge in St. Mary Mead, a man whose disappearance was never solved, a man whose photograph she now had sitting on her desk. So, he hadn't vanished. He'd followed Letty Harwood, now Letitia Blackwell, back to England, and someone had killed him at Greystone Manor. Inspector Cox stood by the drawing room fire, flipping through the official letter he had just received. "His name is Gerald Winshaw," he said. He told Miss Marple later that day when she arrived we had to go through old Pally's files, a missing persons case. Johannesburg, 1938. No confirmation until your tip about South Africa narrowed the search. Miss Marple merely nodded. "He must have found her," she said quietly, "after all these years. But why now? Why here? That," she said, "is the question." Croc walked out a window outside. The rain had left streaks across the glass. "There's more," said one of the guests. "Mr. Ellis has vanished. Didn't return home, left no word. Neighbors say he packed a small suitcase last night and walked to the station." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "Mr. Ellis," she said thoughtfully. "Such a polite man, always slightly too polite, always asking questions no one else would think to ask." Katak nodded. "And guess what else this South African file mentions? Another man associated with Winshaw and Harwood, an accountant named Harold Ellis, vanished in 1939. Never found." Miss Marple stared at the floor for a moment, then looked up slowly. "Then perhaps Mr. Ellis did just vanish last night," she said. "Perhaps he ran Inspector and Running Means guilt or fear that evening." Marley Combe was quiet again, but not in the peaceful way. A nervous, watching, quiet curtains twitched. More than usual locks were tested twice. The vicar's sermon had fewer verses and more caution. And in Rose Cottage, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk sorting through her notes and memories. 3 people connected by a history of silence. Gerald Winshaw vanished in 1938. now murdered in a locked room. Letty Harwood now. Letitia Blackwell, newly settled and nervously guarding her pissed Harold. Ellis missing again, perhaps for the last time, but there were more leers. Still, someone else had been watching someone who knew enough to kill Gerald Winshaw quietly and vanish without a trace, and if that person was still in Marleycombe, they might kill again. Chapter 5. Secrets in the Cellar. The rain had stopped, but the air in Marley Combe still carried that sharp scent of wet earth, the kind that makes him think of buried things. In Greystone Manor, silence reigned like a house guest no one had invited. Mrs. Letitia Blackwell had left the estate. Since the murder, she claimed exhaustion, grief, emotional shock that Miss Marple, who lived through wars and scandals alike, knew the signs of Samayan hiding behind illness like a curtain on this particular morning. Inspector Kraut paid Mrs. Blackwell another visit, unannounced this time. He found her seated in the conservatory, dressed immaculately but pale. Beneath rouge, she offered him tea, which he declined. "I'd like to ask you again about Mr. Winshaw," he said. "Plainly, I told you everything." "I know," she replied with a tight smile. "That's not true, is it?" The smile faltered. "I beg your pardon." Caddick stepped closer. "You knew him. You were Lady Harwood. Once you were married to Thomas Blackwell after Gerald Winshaw disappeared in South Africa, and yet he shows up dead in your house, Cades. Later, uninvited, you say, with no one but your maid in the room to fend him." Her hands clenched in her lap. "You can't imagine what that time was like with gossip. The suspicion, none of it proven. I left it Albihand, but it didn't leave you behind." Mrs. Blackwell turned away toward the garden. "I didn't kill him then. Who did?" She said. "Nothing, Mrs. Blackwell. I fear protecting someone still. Nothing." Kraut left 15 minutes later with not confession, but with something just as valuable a name: Thomas Blackwell. A husband, long dead, but perhaps not as distant from the mystery as first thought. Meanwhile, Miss Marple stood in the kitchen of Greystone Manor, having convinced Elsie, now somewhat recovered, to show her something few had seen since the Admiral's days. The cellar, it was a low stone chamber, with ancient wooden beams and shelves full of dust-covered dressers. Elsie led the way, holding a small oil lamp, its light popping against walls like a memory trying to escape. "Mind your head, miss." "Thank you, dear." "Hey." They reached a corner where the air grew colder. There, behind an old rack of wine bottles, was something Miss Marple had not expected. A door, narrow, iron-banded goodness, she murmured. "Was this ever in use?" "Not since I started." Elsie said. Mrs. Blackwell said it was storage for her late husband's belongings. Shinky Salat to Miss Marple examined the latch. Old, but not rusted. It had been used recently. "Elsie," she said softly, "do you know where she keeps the key?" The girl hesitated, then nodded toward a hook behind the coloricobinet. Moments later, the key turned with a soft click. Inside, the smell was different, less musty, more chemical. The shelves were lined not with jam or tools, but with boxes, stamped shipping crates, all bearing the name Blackwell and Harwood Mining Limited, Pretoria. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She opened the nearest box carefully. Inside were stacks of old legislation voices, and most shocking of all, bundles of papers marked "Confidentially Gold Dispute, 1937. "Dear me," Miss Marple whispered for a moment. The papers was a letter, and on that letter was Gerald Winshaw's signature in a line written in his own hand. "I will return to England. She cannot bury this forever." An hour later, Inspector Craddock stood beside her, reading the letter under the light of a desk lamp back at the station well. He said grimly, "This changes everything." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied. "It confirms that Gerald Winshaw came to Marley with intent nonsense, and that he likely confronted Mrs. Blackwell." Crack looked up. Could she have killed him to protect the truth about the company? Miss Marple shook her head. "No, if she intended to silence him. She would have burned those papers years ago. She hid them, which means she feared someone else might use them. Someone already knew. Caddick blinked Ellis. Exactly that. Evening, a geese letter arrived at Rose Cottage. No return, just Miss Marple opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet typed on an old machine. Stay out of it. Miss Marple, some things were meant to stay buried. This is not your concern, a friend. Read it twice. Then she smiled faintly. Oh dear, she murmured, folding the paper. If someone's threatening an old woman with knitting needles and curiosity, then we must be getting close. Chapter 6. A visitor in the night. At night, a dense fog rolled over Marleycombe, wrapping the village insolence and obscuring even the nearest hedge. It was the kind of fog that Medethi gaslights flicker like ghosts and turned every footstep into a question mark at Rose Cottage. Miss Marple did not sleep. She sat by the fireplace in Hurst Mill parlor shawl, wrapped around her shoulders, the anonymous threat letter resting on the table beside her. Her knitting was in her lap, but her hands were still. It had been many years since someone had warned her off a case so directly, and even then, even in wartime, few had dared threaten her so plain-lipped. What chilled her wasn't the tone of the letter, it was the word friend. Beckos. No friend would ever address her so. Cry at precisely 1:14 a.m. The silence was broken by a sound, soft but unmistakable, a knock. Not at the front door, at the side one, the small door that led from her garden to the scullery. She roused slowly, taking her time. The fog outside pressed against the window panes almost dilate. She opened the side door just a crack. There, standing in the mist, was a figure, hat, low collar, up, breath rising in white clouds. Miss Marple, the voice wise male and shaking. Yes, she replied. Come, Sever. I shouldn't be here, but I'd know where else to go. She studied the man carefully. Was Mr. Ellis, the one had vanished, the one who until now had been presumed fleeing. Come in, she said gently, and do be quiet. I've made some tea. 15 minutes later, we sat opposite each other by the fire. Ellis held his teacup in both hands, like it might slip otherwise. I didn't kill him, he said suddenly. I swear, I never said you did. Miss Marple replied. But you thought it. I considered that someone with your past, your real past, might have had reason to stop him from exposing something. Ellis sighed, setting his cup down. I didn't want to lie, he said. But once I saw Gerald, I knew. I had Todd disappear again. You knew him. I worked for him, Ellis said bitterly, back in Toria. I was just a clerk, but, I knew enough to see what was coming. He was gambling with investor money, using one partner to cover, debts from another. Letitia knew, but she believed he'd change. He didn't. What happened? He vanished in 1938. People said he drowned. Some said she helped him run. I don't know. But after she married Blackwell and came back to England, I thought it was done. And then Gerald came back. Ella's face grew pale, and not just to make peace. He wanted revenge. Said he'd burn it all down. Told me in the hallway, day of the party, pulled me aside, hissed it like a curse. So you ran. Yes, I didn't kill him, Miss Marple. But I knew if the police found out I lied about my name, I'd be the first suspect. So I packed and went to Micah's aunt's. And Devon, why come back? Ellis looked up, ice bloodshot. Because someone followed me. Someone broke into the cottage, tore through my suitcase. I barely got away. Don't think they wanted me arrested, Miss Marple's voice was quiet. You'd think they wanted you dead by the following morning, Miss. Marple had spoken to Inspector Croak. She gave no names, not yet, but shadowed him that Mr. Ellis was no longer a fugitive. In her mind, and that Sumia Niels, someone closer, was far more dangerous. Kadak, though surprised, trusted her instincts enough not to work. Someone sent you that letter? He said. And now they're hunting Ellis. That means they're desperate, desperate people, as Marple said. Mac mistakes, and when they do, we catch them back at Greystone Manor. Mrs. Blackwell stood alone in her husband's study. She stared at a photograph. On the desk, framed image of herself and Thomas on their wedding day. Her hand trembled as reached for the drawer inside beneath. A faded ledger lay as no object. A silver key. She held it tightly. Then, hearing a noise outside, perhaps the creak of a floorboard, she turned sharply, eyes wide, but no one was there that night. Miss Marple did not sleep again. Instead, she wrote down a single sentence in her journal. If Gerald came to expose the past, someone killed him to protect the future. And underneath it, she wrote, it was not Letitia, because I know she was sure of it. Letitia Blackwell knew fear, guilt, and regret, but not murder. No, someone else had silenced Gerald Winshaw, and that person was still herein. Marley Peace, Waiting in the Fog, Chapter 7. The Vicar's Unspoken Sermon. Sunday dawned with deceptive gentleness. The sun returned to Marley, casting golden light across dripping leaves and misted windows, as if trying to wash the village clean of everything it had seen. But sin, as Miss Marple often reflected, had a longer memory than the weather. At St. Luke's Church, the pews were full, more so than usual. People had come not only for the sermon, but for that spectacle. Murder had a way of bringing out even those who rarely remembered their prayerlessness. Marple arrived quietly, as always, and took her usual place near the back hat, neatly pinned gloves folded in her lap from the pulpit. Reverend Paratapagan. The service, in its usual gentle tones, but those who knew him and Miss Marple didn't notice something strange. He hesitated, more often lost. Plus scene. The Psalms stumbled slightly on the Lord's Prayer. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The Reverend, she realized, was distracted, troubled, and for a man who had presided over funerals, wartime telegrams, and whispered confessions, sought meant something. Indeed, after the service, tea and biscuits were served in the parish hall as usual. Miss Marple waited patiently until the crowd thinned, until only a few well-meaning ladies remained arranging hymnals and wiping teacups. Then, with deliberate softness, she approached Reverend Petta. "You look quite pale today, Vicar," she said kindly. "I do hope it's not your heart again." He managed a one smile. "Oh no, it's Marple. Merely the burden of reflection." She waited one, did not press a man of the cloth. Finally, he sighed. "Would you walk with me, Miss Marple? The garden's quite still." This morning, they stepped out Sedento, the little gravel path behind the vestry, where Maralt nodded quietly. "And son, I have a question," she said gently, "and I ask it not as an accusation, but as an observer. Why was Mr. Ellis at your home 2 days ago, before he disappeared?" He stopped walking. A bird called, frowned. "Yew tree." "I didn't lie," he said. "I simply omitted." "Why?" "Because he was afraid. He asked for sanctuary, as some do, and Yelford him tea, not knowing who he truly was. We spoke, and I saw a man unraveling." Miss Marple nodded. "Did he confess anything?" The vicar shook his head. "No, only that someone from his past had returned, and that there would be consequences." They walked a few more steps in silence. Then Reverend Para turned to her, eyes full of quiet dread. "Miss Marple, I believe someone in this village has sinned deeply, and I don't mean just the act of murder. I mean something older, rotten, at the root." She met his gaze evenly. "Yes, Vicar," she said, "and we are very close to uncovering it." That afternoon, Inspector Crope knocked on the door of the Marley Library. It was closed to the public on Sundays, but the librarian, Mrs. Archer, had agreed to a private request. He found her, in the back room sorting index cards. "Inspector," she said, adjusting her spectacles, "you asked about mining companies. I've done a bit of digging." She handed him a faded folder, labeled Blackwell and Harwood Linted Public Filings. A 1935 to 1942. Nothing local, she said, but there was an article the Toria Mercury 1938 scanned. Here it mentions a financial dispute involving the company Kritakapand. The folder, the article detailed a shareholders' lawsuit against Rod Winshaw for fraudulent records, false exports, and vanished funds. These shareholder, one Thomas Blackwell Crock, frowned. So Merce Blackwell's late husband hadn't just married her after the scandal. He had been involved in it, but which side had he been on meanwhile at Swirl's cottage? Miss Marple sat with a list in her hand, names, dates, and notes she had gathered in the past few days, and one line stood out. Thomas Blackwell filed suit against G. Winshaw, 1938, married Letitia Carwood, 1939, died 1949, fall from stairs. She frowned. Too many accident. Many sudden vanishing acts. Letitia Blackwell might not be a killer, but Shay had certainly been caught between dangerous men, and one of them, maybe not Winshaw at all, had never stopped watching Miss Marple rose suddenly and opened that drawer, where she had kept the anonymous letter on the envelope, barely visible under the light, was the faintest hint of perfume, lavender, and something else. Old Spice, masculine, bitter, not Gerald, not Elish, had smelled it before on someone who hadn't spoken. Muckbutt had been everywhere since the murder, who always helped carry trays, fetched umbrellas, tidied hymnals, a man so unnoticeable people forgot he existed. Miss Marple's hand tightened. It was time to visit the sexton. Chapter 8. The man who kept the keys. The Marleycombe churchyard was on of those places where time settled like moss, slow, soft, and doubt-consuming. Weathered gravestones leaned into each other like old friends sharing secrets. Ivy crawled up the stone walls, crows watched from the steeple, and in a little brick shed behind the church lived Mr. Alfred Greaves, the village sexton most people never gave. Alfred, much thought. He was a man of few words and many tools, spades, lamps, chisels, keys, and moved through the village like a shadow in worn boots. But Miss Marple had always known people who are invisible are often the ones who see everything she was. Just past 4 when she arrived, stepping carefully along the gravel path, umbrella in hand. The air was still, and the scent of freshly turned soil clunked on everything. She knocked gently on the open door of the shed. Mr. Greaves, from inside, a rustle, then his voice dry as autumn leaves. Miss Marple. He emerged from the gloom, wiping his hands on a rag. He was wiry with sharp cheekbones and eyes the color of stormwater. A cap hung low over his brow. Apologies for disturbing you, she said politely. I wondered if I might ask you something about the church and the people who visit it. He gave a grunt, neither yes nor no, and gestured to wart, an overturned crate. She sat. He leaned against the wall, arms folded. I expect you've heard about the recent tumblessness. Hard to miss, he said. Miss Marple nodded. And I expect you saw Relas leave the village. His eyes narrowed slightly. Saw someone heading toward the station late that night. Couldn't say who, but you didn't report it. He shrugged. Didn't seem right, too. Didn't seem wrong, either. Just seemed quiet. And the man who died, she asked softly, Mr. Winshaw, had you seen him before? A pause, longer than necessary. Then no. Miss Marple tilted her head. You didn't strike me as someone easily fooled. Mr. Greaves, and certainly not someone you hope forgets a face. Looked away. She tried another tack. You've been that Kirch sexton for what? 30 years, 34, so you'd know every hidden lock, every passage, every key now. He turned to Harrod. Something flickered in his eyes. Not fear, but calculation. What exactly are you asking, Miss Marple? I'm asking, she said gently, whether someone asked you to open the back door of Greystone Manor the day Gerald Winshaw was killed. The shed was utterly still. Then, after a long silence, Alfred Grieve answered. I didn't know who he was. Not his name, just that he paid me cash to pen the old kitchen door. Said it was a surprise visit, asked me to wait 5 minutes, then lock it again from the outside. Miss Marple's lips tightened and T nodded. Didn't think much of it. I've done worse things for less whopped. You, his jaw shifted. I can't say you won't. She corrected him, which isn't theism. He looked at her, then truly looked, he told me. She'd ruined his life, said he had a right to be heard. And did he mention someone else, me, helping him a pause? No, but he was afraid that much. I saw Miss Marple. Rose slowly. Thank you, Mr. Greaves. You've been very helpful. He didn't reply, but he watched her all the way down Thepeth and did not wave goodbye that evening at Rose Cottage. Miss Marple sat, once again, with her notebook open, a timeline now formed. Clearly, Gerald Winshaw paid Alfred Greaves to unlock the manor's side door. He entered quietly, likely before Tia. At some point before being discovered, he confronted someone, not Letitia, and that person killed him. Ellis fled. Someone sent a threat letter. Someone searched Ellis's belongings. Someone wanted everything buried. Again, Miss Marple dipped her pen into the inkwell and wrote a name in the margin, not Greaves, not Ellis, but Thomas Blackwell Bouquets. The missing piece was him. He had sued Winshaw, then married Letty, then but nothing about Thomas Blackwell had ever sat quite right. There were no public records of the supposed fall that killed him, no obituary, no police report. Suddenly, Miss Marple realized, what if Thomas Blackwell never died at all? What if he had taken a new name? What if he had returned to Marley, come quietly to watch over Letty or watch over the past? Her eyes flew to the list of village residents. She circled in Namathan, stood late that night. She left Rose Cottage, alone, with only the moonlight and her thoughts for company. She did not lock her door, because Shaq knew, if she was right, someone would come to silence her before morning, and she was ready. Chapter 9. The Man Behind the Mask. Midnight in Marley Combe had a stillness that could unsettle the heart, not because of what one could hear, but because of what one couldn't. At Rose Cottage, the lights were out, the lace curtains drawn, everything looked peaceful, but Miss Marple was awake. She sat in her parlor chair, the fire dimmed, a half-finished sock in her lap, and her notebook now closed. She was not knitting. She was waiting in the house. Creaked occasionally, an owl called once, and then full silent. Somewhere far off a clock struck one, then at last a sound. Soft, deliberate. The back door. Miss Marple rose quietly, took the small torch she had placed by the sideboard, and moved without panic. She had locked the back door, of course, but left the key where an intruder might find it, tucked just inside the cracked flower pot bait. She waited in the hallway, watched this shadow move through her kitchen, a silhouette of a man, careful, confident, erect. The parlor. She switched on the lamp, and there he stood, caught in Thorham golden light, the Reverend Peretta, except not in his clerical glare. He wore an old wool coat, gloves, and in his hand was a folded envelope. Either of them spoke for a long moment. Then Miss Marple said softly, "You've come to kill me, haven't you?" He didn't blink. "I hoped you wouldn't see it. It truly did. I see most things." "Reverend," she said, voice calm, especially when they are hiding in plain sight. She gestured toward the armchair, set slowly, carefully, like a Mannering, the edge of something he could not turn back from. "I'm not proud of it," he said. Miss Marple nodded. "But you blended." He looked up at her, the eyes once kind behind sermons and tea, were cold, now tired. "I was Thomas Blackwell. I know my death was arranged. I bribed a local coroner in Johannesburg. Letty believed I was dead, and I let her wipe us. I was ruined. Gerald had destroyed everything, our business, our name, our life, and Letty, she still defended him. I knew I had to disappear, start again. And so, you came here. Yes, he said, a new name, a new calling. I found solace in the church I married. It's God, because I could no longer be a husband to Letty. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but when Gerald returned, he swallowed hard. I saw him the day before the tea in the churchyard. I knew him at once, Hesmerk said. He'd exposed everything that Letty had lied, that I had faked my death and you couldn't. Aloud that he nodded. I waited for my moment. He slipped into the manor through the side. I followed him upstairs. He was raving about taking, lighting with him, about reclaiming everything. I tried to talk him down. He laughed, said Letty still loved him. His hands shook slightly. I struck him once. He felt I didn't mean for it to be fatal. But when he didn't get up, Miss Marple sighed. You panicked. I dragged him into the east bedroom, pulled the curtain to block the light, hid the blood with a cushion, waited until the maid found him. You tried to send me a warning too, she said, pointing to the envelope. He gave a broken smile. You were always clever, always watching. He thought, if I scared you off, I'm not so easily frightened. No, he whispered. You're not outside. Dawn was beginning to lighten the sky, gray and soft mist. Marple stood slowly. Used to have a choice, Thomas, she said. Confess, not just to me, but to thy Inspector. Letty deserves to know the truth. He stood, as if carried by some internal weight. Set the envelope on her table. I will go, he said, to the station. He gave you a bitter smile. To the church first, and then he left quietly, without another word, disappearing into the breaking morning light, like a ghost returning towards grave. 2 hours later, Inspector Cocker arrived at Rose Cottage. Miss Marple met him at the door, a shawl around her shoulders, a quietness in her eyes. I assume he came. Katak asked. She nodded. And he told the truth. Will he turn himself in? I believe already has, she said. And when Kratok left to fetch him, he found Reverend Peretta, or Thomas Blackwell, seated alone in the church nave, head bowed, hands folded, waiting. Chapter 10. A widow's burden. Thiessen had risen fully over Marley, but the village felt no warmth. That morning word of Reverend Peretta's arrest spread faster than wildfire, not because he was beloved, though many respected him, but because he had been a fixture, a trusted figure in whom the entire village had quite literally put its faith. And now, who was a killer? Or so they said. At Greystone Manor, Letitia Blackwell sat in her drawing room, wrapped in a shawl she didn't need. Her eyes, dry and wide, stared into the empty fireplace. Marquines the poodle sat moving by her feet. She hadn't spoken since the constable informed her that her long dead husband, the one she had mourned, buried in her memory and left behind, had not only been alive all these years, but had murdered Gerald when Miss Marple entered without ceremony. Tay, she said gently, in answers, we need both. I think Letitia didn't move. He let me believe he was dead, Jane. He wrote me a letter saying he couldn't live. With what had happened, I wept for him. I buried him in my soul. I believe he thought he was protecting you, Letitia, scoffed by letting me live in shame. I was blamed for everything. They thought I helped Gerald flee, that I'd lied about the finances, the lawsuits, the theft. You did that. Letitia looked at her. Finally, no, I was a fool. I loved them both in different ways. Thomas was steady, righteous. Gerald was brilliant, dangerous. Life. I thought I could fix him. She gave a small, bitter laugh. I suppose I was their old villain all along. Miss Marple reached across and took her hand. Letitia, you are many things, but not a villain. You were caught between two men who used the word love as a weapon. That is not your crime. Letitia's eyes filled suddenly, not with tears, but with something far more painful. Relief. You believe me? Of course, I do. Outside, the village was adjusting to the news. Some were scandalized. Others quietly admitted that vicar had always seemed to come to be true in the bookshop. Mrs. Barton whispered that she'd seen him one evening years ago, reading not the Bible but a South African newspaper in the bakery. Mr. Holloway simply said. Well, you never know what's behind a man's eyes, Doy. But Miss Marple wasn't finished yet. She sat in her parlor with her notes and timelines laid out before her, because something still didn't fit him. Blackwell had killed Gerald Winshaw, yes, but someone else had sent anonymous warning, searched Ellis's belongings, and Devon paid Greaves to say anything until Prest Thomas was meticulous, controlled, not the type to Torton, not the type to panic and chase. Ellis knew there was still someone else who had more to lose if the past resurfaced, someone who knew the story but didn't. One had told the next morning, Miss Marple visited Spectre Croup. I have a theory. Skay, she said simply. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Of course you do. The true killer of Gerald Winshaw was Thomas. Yes, but the force behind the fear, the one who's been trying to bury past even now, is someone else. Credoc narrowed his eyes. Go on. She held up a list of names. Only a few people knew exactly when the list disappeared. Only a few would know about Gerald's background, and only one had access to the church records and the backroom files in Thalabury, where the Victoria lawsuits were hidden. Crack's eyes widened. The librarian, he said. Incredulous, Mrs. Archer. Miss Marple nodded. She was Thomas's older sister, born Alice. Blackwell changed her name years ago. She moved to London. She returned to Marple after the war, quietly, and she's been here ever since, keeping watch. Why would she? Because she helped Thomas vanish. She falsified the death record in the church book, bribed a coroner with family money, hid him in plain sight. And when Gerald returned Shepanicked, she feared prison exposure. She tried to scare Alice off, threatened me. She knew everything. Crowd stood slowly. World need proof. Miss Marple smiled. I believe you'll find some of the original mining documents, some letters from the fake funeral hidden beneath the floorboards. The church library. Croc paused. You checked. I merely observed where the dust had been disturbed. Later that day, Miss Archer, calm, composed, was arrested at her desk with barely a word as she was lead away. She turned once to Miss Marple and said, only I would have done anything to protect my brother. And Miss Marple replied, I believe you did. Chapter 11. The final stitch had rained again in Marley. Not a storm this time, but a soft, persistent drizzle. It painted the stone pathways, darkened, left the hedge glistening with dew, the kind of rain Miss Marple thought that felt like Thelen itself was sighing in relief. The arrests had been made, confessions had been taken, but something in Miss Marple's mind refused to settle. She sat by her pile of fire at Rose Cottage, a teacup cooling beside her knitting untouched in her lap, the sock she'd begun days ago remained half done. Usually by now she would have finished a whole pair, but not this time, because the case, though closed in the eyes of Inspector Crack, still felt unfinished in hers. Yes, Thomas Blackwell had killed Gerald Winshaw, but in armament of passion. Yes, his sister, Alice Archer, had worked behind the scenes to hide his past, but there was something else, something that lingered like the last note of a hymn going through an empty church. And then it struck her. It wasn't though Gerald died that troubled her. It was why he had come in the first place. The next morning, Miss Marple returned to Graston Manor alone. Letitia Blackwell received her in silence. She wore black now, though not in mourning. She insisted it was for dignity, not death. Why have you come, Jane? She asked, pouring tea with shaking hands, to ask you one final question. Letitia sat down. I've told you everything. No, Miss Marple said quietly. It's told me what you believed, but you haven't told me what Yalgoon. Letitia looked away. The clock ticked. I believe Gerald came here, Miss Marple continued, not just to confront Thomas, not to demand money, not for revenge. Letitia's fingers gripped her teacup. I believe he came to see you. Letitia flinched. You were lovers once, Miss Marple said. You tried to hide it bit, in every glance, every hesitation. I saw it, you knew him better than you ever admitted. And you still felt something when you saw him again. Letitia set the tuck-up down with a clink. Yes, she whispered, I loved him still. Fool that. Stan, why didn't you say so? Because Letitia said bitterly he didn't. Come foam, not truly. He came because he wanted something. I don't know what. Perhaps Todd was the knife, or perhaps just to remind me that I'd once belonged to him. She paused. He said I owed him my life. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Did he threaten you? Letitia nodded. He said had letters from South Africa that would destroy me, that I'd helped him with funds I hadn't. But back then, it was enough to be seen near a scandal and be damned with it. He said he'd show them to the police if I didn't give him something. What did he want? Letitia's voice shook. Now everything, a place to live. My money, my name. He said he'd make me his wife again, that the church could have convinced we were still wed. And you refused. I told him to get out, that he'd burn the letters. If he tried anything, she looked up, eyes brimming with panic. The next morning, he was dead, miss. Marple sat in silence for a long moment. Then she said, Letitia, I believe you. Letitia nodded, tears finally falling. And I believe, Miss Marple added softly, that Gerald never had those letters, that he was bluffing, because if he had such evidence, would have found it by now. But they haven't. Letitia gave a broken law. I suppose he died the way he lively. Miss Marple stood and touched her shoulder gently. Then let him rest and let yourself live. That evening, Miss Marple finally read into her knitting. The sock was still half finished, but now she'd pick it up her needles and began to work the quiet rhythm of the yarn, slowly returning stitch by stitch, row by row. Outside, the last of the rain had stopped, and the village of Malcolm, though scarred by the recent darkness, began to breathe again. And somewhere in the stillness, Miss Marple smiled, because the truth had been tangled in lies, but she had unraveled it, as she always did, with patience, with kindness, and with eyes that missaid nothing. Chapter 12. Shadows lifted, but scars remained. The village of Marley slowly returned to its gentle rhythm. The church bells rang once more, not just as a call to worship, but as a signal of resilience. Life, with all its flaws and secrets, went in at Rose Cottage. Miss Marple enjoyed a rare, quiet afternoon. The windows were a pen, letting in the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming roses. Her knitting needles clicked softly, weaving calm into yarn, but peace knew was often just a pause between storms. The villagers too were settling the Kento Tea, their routines, the bakeries. Shelves were filled, the post office buzzed with familiar greetings, and even Greystone Manor, now silent, was less of a looming presence in daily talk. Yet beneath the surface, subtle changes had taken root. Letitia Blackwell had left Marley Combe quietly. Some said she moved to a seaside town in Devon, seeking solace and anonymity. Others whispered she was visiting relatives abroad, or simply disappearing from a past too painful. Toe-face Inspector Krauk closed the case file with a mixture of relief and weariness. Justice in this quiet corner of England had been served, but at a cost that no one would forget. Mr. Ellis, having returned from Devon, was quietly welcomed back, his name cleared. He took a job at the local library among the books, and the dust man finally given a second chance, and Dalford Greaves. The sexton went back to his duties, though he moved with a little shadow in his steps. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky blushed pink, Miss Marple walked the familiar path through the village. She paused by the churchyard, where the gravestones caught the last light, their worn inscriptions whispering stories of lives long past. She thought of the tangled web that had nearly swallowed the village whole, greed, betrayal, love, in fear of how people's pasts, like the curtains at Greystone Manor, often hid more than just dust and light. And she thought of herself, quiet observer in a loud world, back at Rose Cottage, her knitting complete. Miss Marple sat back and smiled softly. Another mystery solved, but more importantly, another story of human frailty, gently laid tourist for in Marley Combe as anywhere. It was never just about the crime, it weighs about the people, their secrets, and the delicate threads that hold a community tiger, even when those threads are stretched, pulled, and almost broken. Chapter 13. Echoes in the garden. The early morning mist still clung to the hedgerows of Marley when Miss Marple found herself drawn to the garden behind Greystone Manor. Though the house was empty and silent, the garden had a life of its own, wildflowers pushing through neatly trimmed beds, and the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and forgotten memories. She walked slowly along the gravel path, her footsteps softened by the thickening fog. It was here, she thought, that many secrets had been sown, watered by years of whispered fears and hidden resentments. As she paused beneath an ancient oak, Hergus caught a weathered bench, its paint peeling and faded. She sat quietly, feeling the weight of the past settle around her like the cool morning air. Moors stirred the laughter of a younger Letitia Harwood, playing among these very flowers. The heated words exchanged under the fading light of dusk, and the footsteps of men who walked these grounds, carrying burdens heavier than their own for Miss Marple. The garden was more than just a place. It was a silent witness, a repository of truths too fragile to speak aloud. Kia, and as the sun finally pierced the mist, casting golden shafts through the leaves, she resolved listen more closely to the echoes that lingered there, because in Marleven, the quietest places held the loudest secrets. Chapter 14. A letter found among the roses. Days later, as the Villa Grey prayed for the annual summer feet, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor, a young gardener named Thomas Mills, who worked at Greystone Manor. He arrived at Rose Cottage with a hesitant knock, holding a small folded envelope, yellowed by time. Miss Marple had bacon. I found this, tucked beneath a loose stone in the rose garden. Thought you might want to see it. She took the letter, carefully breaking the delicate seal. The handwriting was elegant, but hurried. It was a letter addressed to Gerald Winshaw, dated just weeks before his disappearance in South Africa. The words spoke of debts, betrayal, and a desperate plea for mercy, but most chilling was the final line. If I do not survive, you will know how betrayed us all. Miss Marble's eyes narrowed. Some enclosed had known of the Lamaja danger long before the murder, and someone had feared exposure enough to silence him forever. Chapter 15. The silent confession. Miss Marple spent the following days poring over the letter, piecing together the cryptic clues hidden within its careful wording. Each phrase hinted at alliances broken and trust betrayed, but it was the phrase, hope trade us all, that haunted her most. One afternoon, she invited Elsie, the maid, for tea at Rose Cottage. The young woman arrived, shilly clutching her apron nervously. Elsie, Miss Marple began gently. Do you remember anything unusual from days before Mr. Winshaw's arrival at Greystone Manor? Any whisper conversions, secret meetings? Elsie hesitated, then nodded. There was someone often at the manor late at night. I never saw his face clearly, but I overheard Mrs. Blackwell speaking with him quietly in the studies. Looked frightened. Did you ever see this man enter or leave through the garden? Elsie's eyes widened. Yes, once through the back gate near the rose bushes. Helped in a hurry, clutching papers. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. And did Mrs. Blackwell ever speak of trust or betrayal? The maid Chance trembled once. She said, not everyone here is who they seem to be. Some wear masks to hide their true selves. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Thank you, Elsie. You've helped more than you know. That evening, the threads of a silent confession began to weave themselves into a clearer picture. Someone in Greystone Manor had betrayed Gerald Winshaw long before his fatal visit. Someone willing to keep secrets. Tony Cost. Chapter 16. The Hidden Ledger. Following Elsie's revelations, Miss Marple knew there was one place she had yet to thoroughly investigate: the old study in Greystone Manor, where Mrs. Blackwell had whispered secrets and where so much had been concealed, accompanied by Inspector Crike. She returned to the manor under the gray light of a cloudy morning. The house was silent but heavy with expectation. The study door creaked open to reveal a room lined with bookshelves, thick curtains, and an imposing desk scattered with papers. Remnants of a past, still clinging stubbornly to represent Miss Marple's keen eyes, scanned the room and soon found what she was looking for: a loose floorboard near the desk, barely noticeable under a faded rug. With some effort, they lifted it to reveal a small wooden box. Inside lay a ledger bound in worn leather and yellowed with age. Opening it carefully, Miss Marple's eyes traced the entries: financial transactions, coded notes, and names crossed out in haste. One name appeared, repeatedly called Ellis. The ledger detailed sums of money exchanged, secret meetings, and warnings, proof of a conspiracy far deeper than anyone had suspected. This ledger confirms what Elsie hinted at, Miss Marple said softly. Harold Ellis was not just a bystander, he was entangled in the deceit led to Gerald Winchaw's downfall. Inspector Croc nodded grimly. And it means more people knew the truth and lied. A boutique. Miss Marple closed the ledger gently. In Marley, some secrets are buried not just in soil, but in silence. Chapter 17. The Confidence de Lamb. As the discovery of the hidden ledger spread through the village, whispers turned into hushed conversations. Marley Coombs' fragile peace was once again threatened by thread of buried truths. Miss Marple found herself reflecting on a curious figure often overlooked: the ever-present Mrs. Barton, the village bookshop owner, with her sharp eyes behind gold-rimmed spectacles and her penchant for quiet observation. Mrs. Barton had seen more than most. One afternoon, Miss Marple invited Mrs. Barton for tea, hoping to uncover insights only a confidant might hold. Miss Barton. Miss Marple began gently. Have you noticed any changes among the villagers since the recent revelations? The bookshop owner smiled faintly. Change? Yes, but more than that. Fear people who once spoke freely now choose their words carefully. And do you know if anyone has been visiting Greystone Manor recently? Perhaps someone trying to hide or retrieve something? Mrs. Barton's gaze flickered bright. There was a man about 6 weeks ago who came looking for Letitia Blackwell. He was quiet but insistent, left behind a package wrapped in brown paper. Do you know who he was? No, but the package was never collected. Rumor has it, it contained letters that could change everything. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. Letters that could unravel entire story. Barton nodded. Indeed, my dear, and in a village like ours such letters are dangerous. Miss Marple felt the puzzle pieces shifting once more. The mystery was far from over. Chapter 18. The curtains that finally fell. The summer fete was in full swing. Village Square, alive with laughter, the scent of fresh pastries, and the soft tune of conversation. Yet, beneath the cheerful bustle, a quiet sense of closure had begun to settle over Mallium. Miss Marple stood near the edge of the crowd, watching the children chase one another around the maple, the sun casting long golden shadows behind the thatched roofs. The mystery that had gripped the village, the murder at Greystone Manor, the secrets, the lies, had finally been unveiled. Thomas Blackwell's confession, Alice Archer's quiet atonement, the hidden ledger, and the mysterious letters had all come to light. The shadows that once clung to the manor had lifted, leaving space for healing. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited Letitia Blackwell. One last time before her departure from the village. Sat in the sunlit drawing room, the heavy velvet curtains drawn back to let in the light that had once been kept at bay. I am grateful, Jane, Letitia said softly, for your kindness, your patience, and your understanding. Miss Marple smiled gently. It was not kindness alone, Letitia, but the truth that guided us. Letitia nodded. I shall carry this village with me always, even with its burdens. Miss Marple walked home through the quiet lanes of Marleycombe, which reflected on the delicate tapestry of human lives, how love and betrayal, hope and fear are woven together behind the curtains we draw and in. That thought chauffeured comfort, because every secret, no matter how deeply hidden, eventually meets thee.